The auctioneer's hammer hung in the cold November air, and nobody wanted Lot 42. A 1953 Farmall Super M, red paint faded to pink, cracked tires, oil stains bleeding black across the engine block, 30 years old and looking every single day of it. Do I hear 1,500? Silence. Martin Hayes stood in the back, hands buried in his jacket pockets, watching the crowd avoid eye contact with the auctioneer. He'd come for implements, maybe a grain wagon. He hadn't planned on buying a tractor, but he knew something nobody else did. This machine had belonged to Ed Pritchard, a man who treated equipment like family, every oil change on schedule, every bolt torqued to spec. 30 years on one farm, never abused, always maintained. It looked like junk. It ran like a dream. 1,200? Come on, folks. This is a good machine. That's when Gary Summers spoke up. John Deere dealer, county seat. Always at these auctions with an opinion nobody asked for. That thing's worth scrap value at best. Maybe 500 if you're desperate. The auctioneer's face tightened. Sir, this tractor runs. Gary laughed. Does it? Ed Pritchard couldn't even give that thing away before he died. Nobody wants these old Farmalls anymore. They're obsolete. Heads nodded. Gary had a point, didn't he? Why buy a 30-year-old dinosaur when you could finance something new, something bigger, something that screamed, success? Martin raised his card. 800. The entire crowd turned. Gary Summers didn't just speak, he laughed, out loud. Martin Hayes, ladies and gentlemen, only guy in the county still farming with equipment older than his kids. A few chuckles rippled through the auction. Martin's face burned, but his card stayed up. I got 800, the auctioneer said quickly. Do I hear 9? Silence. Going once. Twice. Sold to bidder 73 for $800. As Martin walked past to settle his bill, Gary shook his head. You just bought a 30-year-old tractor worth maybe 500. Hope you didn't need that 300 for anything important. I'll manage, Martin said quietly. Gary leaned in. You know what your problem is? You're stuck in the past, running paid-off junk, while everyone else is modernizing. That's why you're still farming the same 200 acres your daddy left you. That's why you'll never get ahead. Martin didn't respond. He paid his $800, got his receipt, and hooked up his new tractor. But he remembered every word, and over the next 15 years, Martin Hayes would prove that every single assumption Gary Summers made was catastrophically, beautifully wrong. But first, you need to understand something critical. This isn't a story about nostalgia. This isn't about being stubborn or romantic about old iron. This is about a man who discovered that the fastest way to build wealth is to never send money to banks for things that lose value. And if you want to know how that $800 tractor led to owning 3 farms worth over $1 million by 1998, keep watching, because Martin's strategy contradicts everything the agricultural industry teaches about success. Martin Hayes was 34 in 1983. 200 acres his father left him when he died in 77. Land paid off, which was something, but not enough ground to get comfortable. Most years he netted around $12,000 after expenses, enough to survive, not enough to thrive. He ran wheat mostly, some milo, small cow-calf operation on the marginal ground. His equipment averaged 20 years old, a 1951 Farmall M, a 1960 International 560, implements that belonged in a museum. Everything was paid for, everything worked, and by 1983 standards, everything was obsolete. His neighbors, farming bigger, leasing more ground, running shiny new equipment, expanding on credit. That was the gospel everyone preached. Scale up, leverage debt, grow, or die. Martin watched them do it. Watched them sign financing agreements for $40,000 tractors. Watched them lease ground they could barely afford to farm. Watched them chase growth like it was oxygen. And Martin made a different choice. He decided that, instead of sending thousands to banks every month, He'd save every dollar he didn't absolutely have to spend. That instead of looking successful, he'd become successful. It was slow, unglamorous, a strategy that made people think he was failing when he was doing exactly what he intended. By November 1983, Martin had $23,000 in savings. 6 years of living cheap, maintaining old iron, resisting every temptation to spend. Most farmers would have used that as a down payment, would have leveraged it into a loan 3 or 4 times larger, would have expanded. Martin was saving it for something else. He was waiting for other farmers to fail. The farm crisis was already starting, though most people didn't see it yet. Land values dropping, interest rates climbing. Farmers who'd expanded aggressively in the late 70s were starting to sweat. Martin saw it coming, saw the math that didn't work, saw debt loads that couldn't survive one bad year. And he knew that when things collapsed, land would get cheap, equipment would get cheap, and opportunity would exist for anyone with cash and no debt. So when he bought that Farmall Super M for $800, it wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. That tractor was worth at least $2,000 in working condition. Martin knew he could put $400 into it and have a machine worth 3 times what he paid. That wasn't collecting. That was investing. He took it home. 3 weekends going through it completely. New fluids, filters, valve adjustment, carburetor rebuild, brake work, electrical cleanup. Parts cost $370. Total investment $1,170. Market value when he finished $2,500 minimum. But Martin wasn't planning to sell it. He was planning to use it to farm land that desperate farmers would soon be selling for pennies on the dollar. When was the last time you saw value where everyone else saw junk? Drop a comment, because Martin Hayes built an empire on exactly that. The farm crisis hit like a freight train in 1984 and 85. Land values crashed. Wheat prices stayed in the gutter. Farmers who'd expanded on credit found themselves trapped. Equipment auctions every month. Foreclosures, estate liquidations, retirement sales from farmers getting out while they still could. Most farmers stayed away. Too depressing. Too close to home. Nobody wanted to watch neighbors lose everything. Martin went to every single one. Not to gawk, not to gossip. To buy. Between 1984 and 1986, Martin bought 6 more tractors. Old machines that ran but looked rough. Farmalls, Internationals, 1 Alice Chalmers. Average price, $750 per tractor. Average repair investment, $400. Average market value after repairs, $2,200. Martin wasn't collecting tractors. He was building inventory. Creating a stable of working machines he owned outright, could maintain himself, that would never require a payment to anyone. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Gary Summers told people Martin was a hoarder, a junk collector, a farmer who couldn't let go of the past. But Martin wasn't collecting junk. He was accumulating capital in a form nobody else valued. And he was about to use it in a way nobody expected. August 1986. The farm next to Martin's went up for auction. 240 acres, decent ground, owned by Bob Mitchell, who'd expanded too fast in 1980 and couldn't service his debt when prices tanked. Clean land, no buildings except an old barn, no house, just raw farmland. At the peak in 79, $1,200 an acre, maybe $300,000 total. Opening bid in August 86, $600 an acre. Martin had gone to the bank the week before. Martin, you want to buy the Mitchell place? I do. Can you make a down payment? I can pay cash. The loan officer blinked. Cash? I've got $31,000 in savings. The ground will probably sell for less than that. I can pay cash and own it free and clear. Martin, nobody buys land with cash anymore. You should finance it. Keep your savings for operating expenses. Why would I pay interest on money I already have? Because that's how farming works now. You leverage your capital to expand faster. I don't want to expand faster. I want to expand safely. Can't lose what you don't owe. The loan officer didn't understand, but he arranged the cashier's check. Bidding started at 600 per acre, went to 650, 700, stalled at 725. Come on, folks, this is good ground. Who'll give me 750? Martin raised his card. 750. One other bidder went to 775. Martin. 800. The other bidder dropped out. Sold to bidder 41 for 800 an acre. 240 acres at 800 per quarter, $192,000. Martin walked up with his cashier's check, paid in full, owned the land outright before sunset. Gary Summers was there. Heard about the cash purchase. Found Martin afterward. You paid cash for that ground? I did. You're insane. You just tied up every dollar you have in land that's losing value. Should have financed it, kept your cash liquid. Or I could own it and not have a payment. Martin, you're never going to get ahead thinking like that. You're still going to be farming 400 acres 10 years from now while everyone else is running 1,000-acre operations. Martin just smiled. We'll see. Here's what Gary Summers didn't understand. What most farmers didn't understand. What the entire agricultural finance industry didn't want farmers to understand. Debt amplifies everything. When times are good, it amplifies growth. But when times are bad, it amplifies failure. And in farming, times are bad more often than anyone wants to admit. Martin's strategy was the opposite. Zero amplification, zero leverage, zero risk of losing everything if one bad year happened. He would grow slower than leveraged farmers, but he would grow steadier, and he would never, ever go backwards. If you're seeing why Martin's strategy was brilliant and not crazy, hit that like button right now. Martin farmed his new 440 acres the same way he'd farmed his original 200. Old tractors, maintained equipment, low overhead. His income jumped, not doubled but close, clearing about $19,000 a year after expenses. Still living cheap, still banking most of what he made, still going to every auction in the county. Between 1987 and 1990, Martin bought 3 more pieces of ground. Small parcels, 40 acres here, 80 there. Awkward pieces that didn't fit other operations, but made sense for his. Paid cash for all of them. Never financed, never leveraged. Just saved money and bought when opportunities appeared. By 1991, Martin owned 600 acres. All paid off. All farmed with equipment averaging 30 years old. All generating income that went straight to savings because there were no payments to make. His neighbors were bigger, farmed more ground, ran newer equipment, looked more successful. But Martin had something they didn't: complete financial security, no land debt, no equipment debt, no operating debt, nothing that could take his farm away if prices dropped or weather failed or markets crashed. The second wave hit in the early 90s, not as dramatic as the mid-80s, but brutal for farmers who'd survived the first wave by refinancing and hanging on. More auctions, more opportunities. 1993. An entire farm came up for sale 2 miles from Martin's place. House, barn, machine shed, 280 acres. Owner had died. Heirs wanted out. Nobody local wanted to make an offer because times were still tight. Starting bid, $200,000 for everything. Martin had $160,000 in savings, 16 years of farming, saving aggressively, buying strategically, building towards something most people couldn't see. He bid $200,000. Nobody countered, paid cash, owned his second complete farm. Same year, same strategy. Now farming 920 acres across 3 properties, everything owned outright. Gary Summers heard about it, couldn't believe it. Drove out to Martin's place one afternoon. Martin, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. How are you doing this? You're buying farms with cash while everyone else can barely make their payments. What's your secret? Martin set down the wrench he'd been using on his planter. No secret, Gary. I don't make payments. Haven't for 16 years. Every dollar I earn either goes into savings or back into the operation. There's no middleman taking a cut. But you're farming with equipment from the 50s. Equipment that works and doesn't require payments. You told me at Ed Pritchard's auction that old equipment was holding me back. But I've bought 3 farms since then. How many farms have your customers bought? Gary didn't have an answer. The difference, Gary, is that your customers send thousands of dollars a month to banks and equipment companies. I keep that money, and over time, that money buys land. By 1998, 15 years after Gary Summers mocked Martin's $800 Farmall purchase, Martin Hayes owned 3 complete farms. Total acreage, 1,400. Total debt, 0. Market value, roughly $4 million. Total amount Martin had paid over 15 years, around $600,000. Equity, $800,000. And the kicker? Martin was still farming with equipment that averaged 30 years old, still maintaining it himself, still refusing to make payments for things that lost value. His neighbors who'd financed new equipment in the early 80s? Most of them were gone, foreclosed or sold out or barely hanging on. The farmers who'd leveraged their operations to scale up fast? Most of them had scaled right back down or out completely. Martin Hayes, the guy mocked for buying paid-off junk at auctions, had quietly built an empire while everyone else was trying to look successful. 2002. Martin was invited to speak at a farm management conference in Manhattan, Kansas. They wanted him to explain how he'd expanded from 200 to 1,400 acres in 20 years without ever taking on debt. Martin stood at the podium, looked out at 200 farmers, and told them the truth. I didn't build this by being the best farmer, he said. I built it by being the most patient investor. I recognize that in farming, land is the asset that appreciates, and equipment is the expense that depreciates. So I minimize the expense and maximize the asset. How? Someone asked. By never sending money to banks for equipment, by buying old machines that worked for pennies on the dollar, by maintaining them myself so I didn't need dealers or mechanics, by saving the difference between what I paid and what everyone else was paying, and by waiting for everyone else's debt to create opportunities for me. But didn't you fall behind? Didn't you lose competitive advantage running old equipment? Martin smiled. Behind who? I own 1,400 acres free and clear. I net about $60,000 a year after expenses. I have no debt, no payments, no financial stress. Most of the farmers who were ahead of me in 1983 are gone now. So who was really behind? The room went silent. The industry wants you to believe that debt is normal, that payments are just part of farming, that you can't succeed without leverage. But I'm living proof that's a lie. You don't need debt. You need discipline. You don't need new equipment. You need knowledge. And you don't need to scale fast. You need to scale safely. He paused. The John Deere dealer mocked my paid-off Farmall at an auction in 1983. 15 years later, I had 3 farms, and he was still making a living off other people's debt. The question isn't who had better equipment. The question is who's still standing. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. After the speech, dozens of farmers crowded around Martin. Questions, notes, wanting specifics. Martin helped every single one. It's not complicated, he told them. Spend less than you make. Save the difference. Buy assets when they're cheap. Never leverage yourself into a position where one bad year can ruin you. That's it. That's the whole secret. Martin Hayes is 75 now. He sold 1 farm in 2015 and retired from active farming. Leased the other 2 to young farmers he mentored. The 1953 Farmall Super M he bought for $800 at Ed Pritchard's auction in 1983? Still running. Still working on one of the farms. 41 years after he bought it, that tractor is still generating value. Total invested over 41 years, approximately $8,000 in maintenance and parts. Total value generated. Impossible to calculate. But that tractor helped farm the land that became a $1 million empire. Gary Summers retired in 2005, sold his dealership. At his retirement party, someone brought up the story about Martin Hayes. You were wrong about him, someone said. Gary nodded. I was wrong about a lot of things. Wrong about debt being necessary. Wrong about old equipment being worthless. Wrong about the whole system, really. Martin figured out what I never did, that the goal isn't to sell more, it's to owe less. So let me leave you with this. Right now, someone is trying to convince you that you need to spend money to make money, that you need new equipment to compete, that debt is just a tool and leverage is necessary for growth. But Martin Hayes proved something different. He proved that the fastest way to build wealth is to stop sending money to banks, that paid-off equipment beats financed equipment every time, that patience beats aggression, that ownership beats leverage. The John Deere dealer mocked his paid-off Farmall at an auction in 1983. 15 years later, Martin had 3 farms worth over $1 million. And that Farmall was still running. If this story changed how you think about equipment, debt, and building wealth, do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel for more stories about people who built empires by refusing to follow conventional wisdom. Second, drop a comment telling me what old equipment you're running that people say you should replace. Third, share this with someone who's feeling pressure to finance equipment or expansion they can't afford. The dealer mocked the paid-off Farmall, but that Farmall helped buy 3 farms, while the dealer's customers lost theirs. Choose ownership, choose patience, choose building something that lasts. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.